So welcome back, everyone. We're excited to be here. Tonight's class will answer a lot of questions that many people had asked tonight's class and lesson number 6. Until now, we've discussed the why, what, and when of Moshiach, the behind the scenes of Moshiach. Tonight, we'll begin to address the how and the who. How Moshiach will unfold, and who is Moshiach that will usher in this era. Is it a person? Is it an idea? Is it some figure that doesn't exist yet? Is it some sort of creature? Who is Moshiach? And so before we get into who is Moshiach, when people hear the idea of Mashiach, when people hear of the idea of the Messianic era, the redemption, many people, their mind immediately wanders to this kind of rabbit hole, black hole that we're all going to be sucked into, and then we're going to have an entirely new reality. Is that how it's going to happen? Is there going to be this entirely new reality? Is it going to happen suddenly? Is it going to be gradual? Is it a reality that we'll slowly ease our way into? So if you look at page 196, text 1, we'll see a sampling of text from throughout the Jewish literature, whether it's the prophets or the Midrash and so on, the Zohar, which doesn't really give us an answer of how this process will unfold. Let's take a look. Text 1 on page 196. The verse tells us, the verse from Malachi, the final prophet in the book of in the prophets, the final book actually of all the prophets. And Malachi the prophet tells us, "Behold, I will send my angel, and he will clear a way before me, and suddenly the God whom you seek will come to his temple." So by raise of hand, if you think this is telling us that Moshiach will be a sudden appearance, raise one hand. If you think this means that Moshiach will be a gradual appearance, raise 2 hands. Okay, we see we have conflicting reports here. Some feel that this shows gradual, some feel that this shows sudden. All right, let's move on to text number 2. Rabbi Yosef Karo, the great 15th century sage who was the author of the Shulchan Aruch. And he says as follows, text 2. Leah, can you read for us text 2, please? On page 197.
When a mortal monarch plans to return to his home, it is typical protocol for his arrival to be announced in advance. An initial announcement may give notice that he will arrive in 10 days. Followed perhaps by a second advisory 5 days in advance, and then 4 days until the final proclamation. The king is approaching the capital. The prophet Isaiah informed us that the Jewish redemption will not unfold in this manner. Rather, it will arrive in the blink of an eye. As he foretold, the first one to Zion, "Behold, here they are, and for Yerushalayim I will give a herald." Isaiah 41:27. In other words, Jerusalem's residents will not notice that all the tribes of Israel are converging on their city before the initial announcement is made by the first individual to reach Jerusalem, who will call out, "Look, here they are, about to enter the city." It will be so sudden that the city's residents will not notice a thing before the reality materializes. The announcement and the event will come as one. Hence, the initial notice, "For Jerusalem I will give a herald," will be, "Behold, here they are."
Thank you. So by raise of hands, 1 hand for sudden and 2 hands for gradual. What does this text tell us? Will the coming of Moshiach be sudden or gradual? There we go. Unanimous. Sudden. All right, let's read text number 3 from the Zohar. When God will raise up the people of Israel and redeem them from this exile, he will open a small, thin ray of light for them. Thereafter, he will open another far wider aperture. Finally, God will throw open the supernal gates that open to all 4 corners of the universe. Again, a reference to Moshiach. And this text, 1 hand implying sudden and 2 hands implying gradual. Gradual. this text 3, first it's going to go in steps. First, God will open a small, thin ray of light. Then he'll open a wider aperture. Then he'll throw open the supernal gates. It's going to be a gradual idea.
Excuse me, is it really gradual? Because it doesn't really say how long after the small, thin ray that the next opening comes. It could be, you know, in a minute. That's not gradual.
You're right. It doesn't say the time. Technically, you could say that it means sudden, but matching it to the prior two texts, it seems that this one is a gradual explanation of the coming of Mashiach, that will happen slowly. Because if it's one immediately following the other, then why have 3 separate steps? Should have just one step. Text 4 from the Midrash. The Jewish people of that generation will say, is it possible that the world functions as usual and nevertheless the redemption will arrive this year? However, they do not realize that Mashiach's arrival will be sudden. This one we don't even have to have a raise of hand. It's quite clear. It says it will be sudden. Text 5. Page 201 from the Jerusalem.
Question. It says, behold, here they are. On page 198.
Right. Yeah, that's a reference to all the Jewish people who will be coming, converging upon Jerusalem for the coming of Moshiach.
Okay.
Text 5. Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta once walked through the Arbel Valley and watched the break of dawn. Whereupon Rabbi Chia told Rabbi Shimon, so will be the Jewish redemption. It will begin with small steps. As it is stated, although I will sit in darkness, God will be a light to me. Then, as it progresses, it will greatly swell and expand. Gradual or sudden? Gradual. There we go. Gradual. So we have these two kind of conflicting reports. Some texts seem to show us that it'll be gradual. Other texts seem to show us that it'll be sudden. Gradual, that slowly but surely God will usher in this era and Mashiach will slowly be revealed to the Jewish people. Sudden, that it's going to happen in a moment's notice, in the metaphor that was used earlier, a blink of an eye. So which one is it? Is Moshiach going to arrive out of the blue, or is it going to be gradual? And for that, as for everything, we look back into the Torah and the Talmud to give us an explanation on how to reconcile the seeming contradiction. And the verse says something interesting. The verse in Isaiah, text 202, tells us something very, very interesting. The smallest will become 1,000. It's a reference, a verse about the time of Moshiach. The smallest will become 1,000, and the least a mighty nation. I am God. I will hasten it in its time. What does it mean, I will hasten it in its time? So the Talmud explains 6b. The same verse that states that the redemption will arrive in its time also states, I will hasten it. Is there a set time for the redemption or not? Asks the Talmud. And the Talmud resolves the seeming contradiction. If they merit, I will hasten it. If they do not merit, it will occur only when its time arrives. What does that mean? That means as follows. We have two options. Option number 1 is termed in the Hebrew be'ita, in its time. There is a set time that God has set aside, that is the day that Moshiach will definitely come by. Say, for example, year 5800. God has decided that year 5800, Moshiach will definitely come. Now, if the Jewish people merit, and they work really hard in unveiling the concealment of the world, we do our job by doing one mitzvah, another mitzvah. So there's a set time that God had set, that God made, that Mashiach will definitely be here by then. if the Jews are meritorious, if we do our job by doing as many mitzvahs as we possibly can and peeling back those levels of concealment, then God will bring Moshiach earlier than its set time. I will hasten it, in the words of the verse. Together with that, if Moshiach comes at a set time, it'll be a gradual coming. If Moshiach comes in a way that God will hasten it, it will be a sudden coming. And so that's how some of the texts that we read earlier are referring to a gradual arrival, because they're referring to an arrival in its time. And some of the texts are referring to a sudden arrival because they're referring to the arrival if the Jewish people are meritorious. But it's important to know that both are of equal importance. Both are necessary. It's important to understand that either option is possible, because believing so creates and forms a firm foundation for the belief of Moshiach. Because if one is only aware of this sudden arrival, then one will never recognize or care to focus on gradual developments that are happening in a system in its time where Moshiach will happen gradually. And if one only feels that Moshiach can happen gradually, then one will never await the coming of Moshiach in a sudden manner, because, hey, it's only going to happen gradually. If it hasn't begun, why should I wait the coming of Moshiach? And the reality is that both can be true. The gradual process can begin, and suddenly we can reach the end much quicker than the gradual process would have reached. It can be a sudden coming in middle of the gradual process, even after the gradual process has begun to unfold. And so to a certain extent, really, both are true, because the gradual process really, in essence, began from day one. The gradual process really began from day one. As we're peeling back the levels of concealment, we're slowly bringing the world into a Mashiach-like state. Now, that doesn't mean, as we'll see soon, it's not the coming of Mashiach. This is not the gradual coming of Mashiach. This is introducing the world to an era of Mashiach. But Mashiach has a set process, as we'll see later in this class, what is the beginning of the coming of Mashiach. Before we get to Mashiach's personality as well, the process of the coming of Mashiach is told to us in the sages explain that before the coming of Mashiach, just like any king will have someone who will herald his arrival, so too with the coming of Mashiach, there is someone who will herald Mashiach's arrival. Who will herald Mashiach's arrival? Elijah the prophet.
Right.
Elijah the prophet will herald the coming of Mashiach. Let's look inside in text 7 about this announcer, the coming of Mashiach, announcing the coming of Mashiach. Verse from Malachi, and it's important to note this isn't just any verse. Malachi was the last of the prophets in the era of prophecy. And he closes his prophecy, the final verse, the final prophecy of all the prophets recorded in the Tanakh is this verse. And what does he say? I will send Elijah the prophet to you before the arrival of the day of God. The day of God is a reference to the Messianic era. And so who was Eliyahu Navi? Who was Elijah the prophet? The book of Kings tells us something that happened with Elijah the prophet that really didn't happen with anyone else. Something quite miraculous about Elijah that wasn't about anybody else. And what does it say? It says that he ascended to heaven in his body. No other person has that distinction throughout all of history. His body was refined in its entirety. It was so refined that it was able to ascend to heaven. in a body. Just before the coming of Moshiach, Elijah will herald his coming, will come and announce that Moshiach is coming. And so when Elijah arrives, his job in heralding the coming of Moshiach is comprised of a number of points. First one being, he will announce Moshiach's imminent arrival. And the Rebbe explains, interestingly, elsewhere, that really Moshiach can come at any moment. But you and I didn't hear Elijah. We didn't hear him announcing the imminent arrival of Moshiach. The reality is that Elijah comes, the Talmud explains that he's not going to come, it's not going to be on this mega loudspeaker that the entire world will hear. He will come to Tiberias. That's what he will come to announce the imminent arrival of Moshiach. And so he comes to Tiberias every single day to announce the imminent coming of Moshiach. If the Jewish people, obviously, like the story, if you recall the story from, I think it was lesson 2, the story where someone asked Moshiach, when is he coming? And he said, today. The day passed and he didn't arrive, and they were explaining it was today if they would listen, heed the words of the Almighty. So too, Elijah every day comes to Tiberias and announces, and the souls of the people there, the souls of those who are ready for Moshiach, the souls hear his announcement. And so Moshiach can arrive today, even though we didn't hear it, even though we haven't heard it clearly, because ultimately, at a spiritual level, Elijah has already announced the imminent arrival of Moshiach. What's the purpose? But on face value, the idea is that he will actually arrive and people will hear him, people will see him coming to herald the coming of Moshiach. What's the purpose of him coming? Aside from announcing the coming of Moshiach, to inspire the Jewish people to better their ways. Moshiach is coming, it's a new world, it's a different world. It's time to step up our game. Also, he will restore prophecy to the Jewish people, because Elijah is a prophet. As well as throughout the Talmud, there are many, many questions that we do not have the answer to. Legal questions, halachic questions. And in those discussions that we don't have the answer, the Talmud concludes with a statement that Elijah will come and answer the questions. He will be the ultimate halachic authority in the days leading up to the coming of Moshiach. And even after that, he will be the halachic authority who will answer any discussions or disputes or arguments that the sages have had throughout all the generations. And finally, Elijah will restore the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the high court, the Jewish Supreme Court. The Jewish Supreme Court, we do not have one nowadays. The Jewish Supreme Court was dissolved shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple, if I recall correctly, unless it was during the era of the Second Temple. I don't remember clearly at the moment. But either way, it was in that era that this Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, was dissolved. The Sanhedrin has 71 members, and they are the ultimate sayers of law. They resided in their place of work was in the temple, just outside at the border of the temple. And that's where they would sit and hear cases. And the Sanhedrin has to be leaders of the Jewish people, very unique personalities, but most importantly, they have to have ordination in a direct line from Moses. Moses ordained Joshua. Joshua ordained those who came after him, and there was an unbroken chain of ordination that was given from Moses. And so to be part of the Sanhedrin, one has to be part of that unbroken chain. But that chain was broken. We lost that chain. And so those who receive rabbinic ordination, it isn't direct ordination from the time of Moses. There were a few generations that did not have that ordination from the time of Moses. Elijah was ordained part of that direct tradition, direct ordination, ordained from someone who was ordained by someone, and so on and so forth until Moses. And so when Elijah comes back, he will be able to ordain 71 leaders or 70 leaders, if he will be part of the Sanhedrin. And they will be able to restore the Sanhedrin. Either way, Elijah is synonymous with the coming of Moshiach, with the redemption. One interesting place to note that, if you look on page 205, is in the illustrated Passover Haggadahs throughout all the ages. There's a tradition that by one of the final steps of the Seder, we open the door to welcome Elijah the prophet to come to our Seder. And so if you look at this picture, you'll notice something interesting. This is a reference to the coming of Moshiach. This is a Haggadah that was printed in 1560. And at the bottom of the Haggadah, you'll notice that there's someone on a donkey, and there's someone behind him with a shofar, blowing a shofar. The one on the donkey is Moshiach. Moshiach's arriving. He's riding on a donkey, arriving to Jerusalem. And behind him is Elijah the prophet, heralding the coming of Moshiach. Parenthetically, we see Moshiach here on a donkey. And we're going to notice it in another place as we continue in the class. The verse in donkey is very important. Why is it important? Why a donkey and not a horse or a mule? Why a donkey and not a chariot or a car, a Tesla or whatever other car? Specifically a donkey. And we find the donkey throughout Jewish history on a number of occasions. If you recall last week, we went through various mega events, various milestones relating to this unfolding of divine revelation throughout our history. We began with Adam and Eve. We continued with Abraham. We continued after Abraham with Moses, the Exodus and the revelation at Mount Sinai. And then we concluded with the temple era, the first two temples. We find the donkey at those junctures throughout history. We find that Abraham, on his way to the Yechidah, on the way to the binding of Isaac, it says he took a donkey with him and his two youth with him, and they walked to the Yechidah, to the binding of Isaac. Later on, we find that after Moses met God at the burning bush, God tells him to go down to Egypt. And so what does he do? He brings his wife and his two sons riding on a donkey. And then finally, we find that with the coming of Mashiach, the verse in Zechariah chapter 9, Zechariah tells us that Mashiach will come a pauper riding on a donkey. Why this fascination with a donkey? And so the mystics explain something powerful, and that is, what was the idea that we explained in lessons 2 and 3? The purpose of Mashiach. The purpose of Mashiach is to reveal in the materialism of this world, to reveal in everything of this world, that ultimately it's divine. Ultimately, the divinity is concealed, and it's our job to reveal the concealed divine energy behind it. That's our mission. And Mashiach will come when we conclude that mission. The Hebrew word for donkey is chamor. Chamor has the same root words and the same letters as the Hebrew word for materialism. Chomer, materialism. In modern Hebrew, when you talk about material for a job or material to study, it's called chomer. The same root word as chamor. So materialism and a donkey have the same root word. In essence, what does materialism, what does a chamor, what does a donkey symbolize? It symbolizes the materialism of the world. And so the idea that we see throughout history, when Abraham used the donkey, what did he use the donkey for? Just materials, just his tools that he needed, the bricks, the stones. There were no people riding on Abraham's donkey. Because the world then was getting somewhat ready for Mashiach. The concealment was being pulled back a little bit, but as we learned in last week, it wasn't pulled back that much. And so the chomer, the donkey, the chamor, the materialism of the world was ready to go with Abraham, ready to reveal its divine essence, but not in its entirety, just its tools, just something superficial. Then as we go through the generations, we come to Moses. When it comes to Moses getting closer, a greater divine revelation, we have that Moses had his wife and his children riding on the donkey. People, important people, but not Moses himself. Because again, we're getting closer to the divine revelation of the chomer, of the materiality of the world, the materialism of the world, the chamor, but it's not there. When Mashiach comes, Mashiach will come riding on the donkey. He himself, the essence of the Jewish people, the leader of Judaism, the leader of the entire world, King Mashiach will come riding on the donkey, which is an expression of this idea that the entirety of the chomer, of the materialism of the world, is now ready for its divine essence. Its divine essence is being peeled back. And so back to the picture, the Haggadah on page 205, that's why Mashiach is coming riding on a donkey, because it's the fulfillment of that verse in Zechariah that Mashiach will come riding on a donkey. And we'll discuss this a little bit at length next week, the technical aspect of Mashiach riding on a donkey. So now that we have this idea that Mashiach will come either sudden or gradual, and that Mashiach will be heralded by Elijah the prophet, who is Mashiach? What is Mashiach? Here's where the fun part starts. Maimonides, in his halachic description of the Messianic era, which we'll discuss at a greater length shortly, clearly speaks of a person who will arrive and whose arrival we must believe in and await. A person will arrive on the scene and then usher in this new era, set this new era in motion. Text 8, page 206, here's a quote from Rabbi Chaim Vital, the author of all of the Arizal's teachings. And he says very clearly, King Moshiach will certainly be a righteous person born of a man and a woman. Who is this righteous person born of a man and a woman? Who is this righteous person that will usher in this new era? Continue with the verse from Isaiah as explained by the Midrash. Text 9. Who would like to read text 9? Shmuel, the lawyer. Text 9, page 207.
Behold, my servant will succeed. He will be exalted and elevated. He will reach tremendous heights. This is a reference to the King Moshiach, who will be exalted over Abraham, elevated higher than Moses, and he will reach tremendous heights, greater than angels.
Thank you. Great resume. Mashiach will be greater than Abraham, exalted over Abraham, higher than Moses. He's going to be greater than the angels. So his resume of his personality, of who he will be, is quite tremendous. It's not just every person can decide he's Mashiach, but it goes further. And Maimonides explains a little bit more about him. Text 10. The King Mashiach who will arise from David's descendants will be wiser than Solomon and a great prophet close to the level of Moses. He will therefore teach the entire nation and instruct them in the path of Hashem, and all the nations will come to hear his words. So he'll be the ultimate prophet, the ultimate king, and the ultimate teacher. Wiser than King Solomon, who's known as the wisest of all men. This statement from Maimonides is taken from verses throughout the prophets. And finally, seeing how great of a person Moshiach is, how great of a personality he is, his great qualities that he possesses, perhaps his greatest quality is what we see here in text 11. Mashiach's uniqueness will be his humility. Despite reaching the pinnacle of greatness, due to which he will teach Torah to the patriarchs and to Moshe, he will nevertheless achieve the ultimate in humility and self-nullification, due to which he will also teach the simplest folk. He's going to teach everyone. Doesn't matter, the youngest child, the most ignorant Jew, or Moses. He will teach Torah to everyone because he is the most humble person. His great humility. Yes, he has all these qualities. He'll be the ultimate king, the wisest person, wiser than Solomon, greater than Moses, a prophet, almost like Moses, because the verse tells us that Moses is the greatest prophet that ever was and ever will be. So Moshiach can't be greater than Moses, but it'll be very close to Moses when it comes to prophecy. But with everything else, he'll surpass everyone from throughout history. So he's going to teach Torah to Moses, but nonetheless, he has no problem with teaching Aleph Beis to a 3-year-old. He has no problem of teaching the basics of Judaism to the most ignorant Jew, because that's who he is. He's the most humble. Why does he have all these qualities? And so here's an interesting kabbalistic idea that the mystics explain related to Moshiach. So before we get to text 12, we'll have a little introduction on this idea, on why Moshiach possesses all these aspects, all these qualities. We know that the soul is not just the soul, and we discussed this somewhat at length in the previous course, Journey of the Soul. The soul has 5 levels. The soul is referred to by 5 different names, and ultimately the 5 different names are expressing 5 different levels of the soul. What are the 5 levels of the soul? The first level of the soul is nefesh. What is nefesh? Nefesh is the vitalizing level of the soul that brings about a biological life, that gives life to our biological life, that gives life to our physical drives, our literal life. What's ruach, the second level of our soul, spirit? That's what gives life to our emotions. Neshama, third level of the soul, is what's generally referred to as the soul. That's is expressed by its intellect. Following that, we have chaya, which is a deeper level of the soul. What's the faculty of that level of the soul? The innate faith that we have. This instinct that we have, that we know certain truths, that we accept certain truths, the innate capacity of faith. And then we have the ultimate level of the soul, the Yechidah, the essence, unity, singularity. What do we mean by that? As a human being, we have all these 5 levels. As a person, we operate on our most basic level, is the biological level. We eat, we sleep, we walk, we talk. These are all very, very primitive to a degree, physical actions that are vitalized by the nefesh. Next, we have our emotions, relationships, feelings about places, about people, about ideas. These feelings, these emotions that we have are vitalized by the ruach. Then we have our intellect, greater level. Following which we have our faith, which is deeper than our intellect, deeper than our emotions. These truths that we know are deeply held convictions that we know, not because they've been proven to us or because they're rationally explained to us, because we know them in our deep innate capacity for faith, our instincts. But then there's the core, the essence. Who am I? The essential core of the soul, which is deeper than all of these aspects, which is really not only deeper than, but is the ultimate and what brings it all home. It's my essence of who I am. And that's who Moshiach is. What do we mean by that? We mean just like in each individual person, we have these 5 levels. So too, the world in its entirety has these 5 levels. There's the basic level of the world. There's the more emotional level of the world, or the way the world operates, and so on and so forth throughout history and throughout our current life, and so on and so forth as it goes through all these ideas. And they're all important because they all have aspects, and people from throughout the world all have specific missions that are associated with various aspects of these 5 levels of the world. And they're all important for the general makeup of where the world is going and the mission of the world. But then there's the essence of the world, where the world is headed, as we explained in lessons 2, 3, and 4, where the world is headed. That essence, the purpose of creation, the culmination of it all, what brings it all together, that essence is really comprised of all those parts, but it's the core of that. Mashiach is a person, the person Moshiach contains within him this lofty soul, which is an expression of that essence of the world. So, for example, if you have a bunch of people and they've never seen an elephant before, and they come very close and they're not able to see the bigger picture, they're blindfolded and they open their eyes. And one guy's sitting by the leg of the elephant and they see, oh, wow, this is a thick tree trunk. And the other person is sitting by the nose of the elephant and the trunk of the elephant and touches it and says, wow, this is an interesting snake. And the next person is sitting on top of the elephant and figures, hey, this is a great mountain. Each person is seeing the elephant from a different aspect and is seeing a different aspect of the elephant. And to a degree, they're all right. It's not a snake, it's not a trunk, but it's something similar to these ideas, but they're not seeing the full picture. Then there's someone who sees it from the bird's eye view and sees, hey, that's an elephant. That's the essence of what it is. It is an elephant. Yes, there's a trunk and there's a leg and there's a tail and there's a body to it. Those are all very important aspects. And then there's the organs of the elephant and there's what it does and so on and so forth. They're all important. They're all part of the elephant. And so all people throughout the entire world and throughout history all had a part in this great mission. But we only saw a very narrow part of it. We only were able to bring to fruition a narrow part of that mission. Moshiach will be someone whose soul expresses the essence of it all, the essence of the world. And that is why Moshiach possesses all these qualities, because it's the ultimate of everything. It's the essence of everything. Let's see it in text 12. Let's see. Betsy, can you read for us text 12 on page 211?
Yes. Mashiach's fundamental quality is that he is the collective Yechidah of the Jewish nation. For the mystics revealed the king David merited the collective soul dimension of Nefesh. Elijah merited the Ruach, Moses the Neshama, Adam the Chaya, and Mashiach will merit the Yechidah. Of the 5 dimensions that each soul possesses, the lower 4, Nefesh, Ruach, Nechama, and Chaya, are individualized rungs with particular features and functions. By contrast, the Yechidah is the soul's singular, indivisible core. Just as this is true regarding each individual soul, its very essence is the Yechidah. The same is true of the life force of all creation. That life force itself has the Yechidah, that it is the very essence of the divine energy that causes it to exist. And this Yechidah is abstract, defying every qualification or form. From the Yechidah, all the individualized branches of divine energy necessary for creation emerge. Now the Mashiach is associated with the collective Yechidah of all of creation. The essential core energy is unlimited, not only in quantity, but in quality as well. It is entirely perfect and complete. Therefore, when this energy manifests in the world through Mashiach, everything will function at the highest and most perfect level.
Thank you. So Mashiach's soul is the embodiment of the very essence of the collective soul of all of creation. Now, Moshiach, does he know about this? Does he know, when does he figure out that he has this special soul? Is he born with it? Does he receive this special soul at a later time? Is he told before he's born or when he's born, by the way, you're Moshiach? Why doesn't he go announce it to the world? I'm Moshiach. So Moshiach's coming. He has this special soul. He's smart. He's smarter than Solomon. Yeah. When does he get all these qualities? When does he get the special soul? So let's see in text 13 from the great 18th century sage, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, known by his book, the Chassam Sofer. And he explains as follows. Moses, the first redeemer, reached the age of 80 years with no knowledge or intuition about his eventual role as the redeemer of Israel. So will it be, God willing, with the future redeemer. When the time comes, God will appear to him, and then the spirit of Mashiach, that until that moment was hidden on high, will descend upon him, similar to the experience of Moshe at the burning bush. How old was Moshe at the burning bush? He was 80 years old. For 80 years, he had no idea about this mission that he was tasked with, leading the Jewish people out of Egypt, being the first redeemer of the Jewish people. He had no clue. But he was given that soul when he led the Jewish people after he had the revelation at the burning bush. So too Mashiach will be given that divine soul, that Mashiach soul, when it's time to lead the Jewish people out of exile. Taking who's Mashiach? How do we know who Mashiach is? Can someone wake up one morning and say, hey, I had a dream. I'm Mashiach. I'm smart. I'm prophetic. I'm Mashiach. I'm going to usher in the era of redemption. Is there some sort of kabbalistic MRI that we can give to this individual and say, aha, look, I see that he's Mashiach? So how do we know if someone's Mashiach? Now, it's important to note that in the study of Torah, there's two types of Torah study. There's Torah study in general, and then there's halachic Torah study. What's the difference? Torah study in general, you can have various opinions about the same idea, and they're all true to a certain degree. And so if someone takes one opinion and someone else takes the second opinion, they can both be right. One can be right, one can be wrong, and there's no real way of knowing who's right and who's wrong, and both opinions are legitimate opinions. When it comes to Jewish law, it doesn't work that way. When it comes to Jewish law, there is the final say. Who's the final say? So there are rules and regulations on how that plays out, and these are all laws that were given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai when it comes to Jewish law. So in the Talmud, you have various laws and various debates and discussions about various laws and various mitzvahs, and they're all true at that point. But once there's a consensus that's agreed upon that this is the law, all the other opinions fall on the wayside and they are no longer legitimate opinions. Once that's the accepted rule. What's the book that we follow? The Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, has been culled from all the sages of all the latter generations following the Talmud, from the Talmud and from the early sages in the between the 9th and the 15th centuries. And they were all culled together and agreed upon in the Code of Jewish Law. And so the Code of Jewish Law becomes the be-all, end-all of Jewish law, and any other opinion is not acceptable. Now, in the Code of Jewish Law, you sometimes have ambiguous statements. Those ambiguous statements, you have various opinions, and they're all legitimate opinions, which is why within a Jewish law, you can have different communities that do things that are slightly different. Sephardic communities, Ashkenazi communities. Within Ashkenazi communities, it depends where in Europe they came from, and so on. Because those are all the ambiguous places in the Code of Jewish Law. But where there is a decisive statement in the Code of Jewish Law, that is the end, and that doesn't change. That is the rule of law according to Torah. What happens if there's an area that isn't addressed at all in the Code of Jewish Law? We go to an earlier decider, an earlier codifier of Jewish law, And if there's no one who argues on him, then he becomes the end-all, be-all of that law. When it comes to the laws of Moshiach, the only codifier of Jewish law, and there is no one that argues with him, obviously he takes it from the Talmud and from the prophets and so on, but he puts it into law. Maimonides, in the end of his magnum opus, what's known by his name, is Maimonides, or Mishneh Torah. In his final book of Jewish law, he has 2 chapters called the Laws of King Moshiach. Those laws, there is no one that argues, and so that is the end-all, be-all. There is no other legitimate opinion to those statements that he makes in those laws that he sets out in the final 2 chapters of Maimonides. And so in those final 2 chapters of Maimonides, Maimonides tells us the law, who is Moshiach, what are the identifying features of Moshiach. Let's have a look. Text 14. David, can you read for us text 14 on page 214?
Sure. Identifying features. When a king from the house of David will arise, who, like his ancestor David, diligently studies the Torah and observes its mitzvot as prescribed by the written law and the oral law, influences all of Israel to walk in the way of the Torah, rectifies the breaches of its observance, and wages God's battles, this person is presumed to be Messiah. If he succeeds in the above, and he builds the temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he is certainly the Messiah.
Thank you. So what is Maimonides telling us? Maimonides is telling us is that there are 2 stages in identifying Moshiach. What are those 2 stages? The first stage is presumed Moshiach. Who's the presumed Moshiach? What does it mean to be the presumed? Sorry? What's the presumed Moshiach? So Maimonides lays out 4 characteristics, 4 features that must be met. First of all, he must be a descendant of King David. A descendant of King David. The verse makes it very clear that the final Moshiach, that Moshiach, the leader of the Jewish people that will usher in the era of the redemption, will be a king from the Davidic line, son after son from the Davidic line, a direct descendant from King David. Which automatically tells us that if a Kohen comes and says, I'm Moshiach, no, can't be Moshiach because he's a Kohen, which means he comes from Levi, not from Judah, which means he's not a direct descendant from the tribe of David. And so that automatically tells us that from 11 other tribes cannot be Moshiach. It doesn't matter how smart they are, it doesn't matter how diligent they are, makes no difference. They can't be Moshiach. Point number 2, they have to be extremely pious and well-versed in Torah. They have to be someone who fulfills all of the 613 commandments and someone who studies Torah diligently. And he observes the mitzvahs as prescribed by the written law and the oral law. So it can't be someone who doesn't put on tefillin. It can't be someone who doesn't keep Shabbos. It can't be someone who doesn't follow the laws of Torah to the T. It has to be someone who keeps everything. Point number 3, he has to work to influence the Jewish nation to follow the ways of Torah and rectify the breaches in observance of Torah. That's what Mashiach is, a person who does that, who works really hard. And 4th, he has to wage God's battles. Now, what exactly that means, is it physical battles or ideological battles? There are various understandings of what Maimonides is saying based on the verses. Many are of the opinion that it's ideological battles. In other words, waging the ideological ideas of, similar to C, of influencing the world at large to understand and accept God and the commandments. So what's the idea of this presumptive title? The idea of the presumptive title is that the presumed Mashiach works on this campaign to try to bring about the recognition of God being the supreme leader of the entire world, to the recognition of and influencing the entire Jewish population to fulfill the commandments, to be better Jews, if you will. And so, as long as those aren't fulfilled, he doesn't complete those missions, it's impossible to know if he's Moshiach or not. But he definitely can be the presumed Moshiach, and we can throw all our weight behind him, accepting that he's the presumed Moshiach, that this individual, person A, will be the Moshiach who will lead the world because he's working on his way to those goals. But then Maimonides continues that there's a way where Mashiach can prove that he is the Mashiach, he is here to stay, he's confirmed Mashiach. What are those 2 points? It's switched around here from the order of Maimonides, I don't know why. To ingather the Jewish people in Israel, and B, to build the third holy temple. Once Moshiach comes, after he does A, B, C, and D, wages God's battle, he's direct descendant from King David, he's supremely pious, he fulfills all the commandments, he influences the Jewish nation to fulfill the commandments and works on rectifying the breach of the fulfillment of the Torah. And then he goes ahead and causes the ingathering of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, and then goes ahead and builds the third temple on the Temple Mount. Once he does that, now we know, he's Moshiach. He's not the presumed Moshiach. He's taken it till the end. He's built the third temple. He is Moshiach. Has there been anyone who fit the bill? Throughout the generations, in our generation, is there someone who fit the bill throughout all generations, throughout this generation? So the Talmud tells us something interesting. The Talmud tells us that, as we explained, Moshiach is not only going to come at a set time, Moshiach can also come earlier than the set time. Moshiach could have come 1,000 years ago. Had the Jews been ready, had they rectified the world, had they revealed the divinity throughout the entire world, Moshiach would have come. But hold on, was there someone who fit the bill of all these levels? If there's someone who fit the bill of all these levels, or at least of the first 4, did he know about it? Did he not know about it? Is there only one person who's Moshiach, or could there be multiple Moshiachs? And so the reality is that every generation has a potential Moshiach waiting, that if the world will be ready, and if God decides that now is the time to bring Moshiach, then that person in that generation will be the Moshiach. Where do we see this idea first? We see it in the Talmud. Text 15 tells us a very interesting story that took place immediately following the destruction of the temple. Roberta, can you read for us text 15 on page 217?
A man was plowing his field when his ox suddenly lowered. An Arab passerby inquired, "What is your nationality?" "I am a Jew," the plowman replied. "Untie your ox," the Arab advised, "and unharness your plow." This was considered a sign of mourning. Why? Because the Jewish Holy Temple has just been destroyed. "What is your source for this information?" the Jew demanded. "I deciphered that from your ox's low," replied the Arab. As they were talking, the ox suddenly lowed once more. "Harness your ox and retie the plow," the Arab exclaimed. "The Jewish Redeemer has just been born."
Thank you. So this Talmudic passage, taken on face value, seems to imply that Moshiach is someone who's about 2,000 years old now. right? If he was born right after the destruction of the temple, he's 2,000 years old. And so somewhere lurking in a cave in the mountains of Judea, there's an old man with a long, long beard that's 2,000 years old, waiting to redeem the Jewish people. But now we understand that it's not telling us that there's someone who's one person throughout all the ages. Every single generation has an individual who has the potential to be Moshiach, who's waiting for that moment when God gives them that soul and they can lead the Jewish people out of exile to bring the coming of Moshiach, to go ahead and build the temple and be the certified, verifiable Moshiach. If that generation doesn't merit it, if they don't reach their goal of fulfilling all the commandments and peeling back all those levels of concealment, Mashiach's not ready to be revealed. That person lost out. He won't be Mashiach. Someone in the next generation will be Mashiach. And so the candidate in every generation is waiting. Maybe I will be the one who will lead the Jewish people out of Egypt. And so in every single generation, there's a Mashiach who's born, which explains that story that we said in lesson 2, I think it was, of untying the bandages, or was it in lesson 1, where Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi went to meet Mashiach and he went to the gates of Rome. In that generation, that was the Moshiach of that generation. That individual who at the gates of Rome was untying his bandages. Now, we know that Moshiach didn't come because that wasn't the only Moshiach. That was the potential Moshiach of that generation. And in text 16, in the words of the famed 15th century sage Rabbi Avadia Bar Tanura, commentator on the Mishnah and on various other works, he says very clearly, in every generation a descendant of Judah is born who is a befitting candidate to be the Jewish Moshiach. And so in every single generation, including in our generation, there is someone who is waiting to be Moshiach. It has to be someone from this generation who's waiting to be Moshiach and who has the physical and spiritual qualities to do the job. And this individual may have not started to do everything, but they definitely are a potential Mashiach, and they already are in somewhat of a leadership position. They've already began to do some of the things, and again, they have to be a direct descendant from the Davidic line, which is why throughout the ages, students have always said that their teacher, if he fit the bill, was the presumed Mashiach. Here's a quote from the Talmud, text 17, on page 219. It's 2,000 years ago, in the times of the Talmud. What is Mashiach's name, says the Talmud? The scholars of Rabbi Shilah's academy would say, his name is Shiloh. As it is stated, the scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes, and all the nations will rally to him. That's it, he's Moshiach. They're not saying that he is the ultimate, he definitely will be Moshiach, because here we are 2,000 years later and he hasn't been Moshiach. What they're saying is that he fits the bill on that generation, he is the potential Moshiach. The scholars of Rabbi Yanai's academy would say, his name is Yinon. As it is stated, may his name endure forever, for as long as the sun, may his name continue. May his name continue as Yinon. The scholars of Rabbi Hanina's academy would say, his name is Hanina. As it is stated, for during your exile, I will show you no favor. Hanina. Some scholars insist that his name is Menachem, the son of Chizkiah. As it is stated, because at the time of the destruction, the comforter, Menachem, that should relieve my soul, is far from me. Rabbi Nachman stated, if the Moshiach is among the living, he is a person who already occupies a government position such as me. As it is stated, their prince shall be of themselves, and their governor shall proceed from their midst. And all these verses are explained by the commentaries how it fits with the names of their teachers or the ideas that they're expressing. Then the Talmud concludes, Rav stated, if the Moshiach is among those currently alive, he is the holy Rabbi Yehuda the prince. If the Moshiach is among the dead, he is Daniel the beloved. And the commentaries have a field day with this final statement, which seemingly goes against some of the ideas that we discussed here in tonight's class. So we're not going to get into it right now. It's a little bit beyond the scope of the class. But the idea that this expresses is that in every generation, there are always people who were the presumed Moshiach. There are always people who fit the bill. And it didn't just stop in the times of the Talmud. In text 18, we see from the great 19th century sage, Sephardic sage, Rabbi Chaim Chizkiah Medini, he writes that throughout all the generations, in each generation, people would assume that a particular individual was the Mashiach, if the redemption were to occur at that time. In his generation, it was declared and accepted that Rabbi Judah the Prince, this is in the times of the Talmud, was the suitable candidate to serve as the Mashiach. Similarly, the students of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Arizal in the 15th century, wrote that he was the Mashiach of that generation. And then a century later, it doesn't mention it here, but a century later, the Or HaChaim HaKadosh was called the Mashiach. That was in the 17th century. He was referred to as the Mashiach. Why was he referred to as Mashiach? Not that he was the verified Mashiach, but he was the potential and even the presumed Mashiach because he fit the bill of what was working. Which leads us to an important point, and that is the idea that Chabad Hasidim always referred to as the Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, as Moshiach. Why is that? The Rebbe fits the bill that we saw from Maimonides of presumed Mashiach. The Rebbe is a direct descendant, son after son, from King David, from the Davidic line. The Rebbe's family, the Schneerson family, has a very clear lineage tree that has been kept throughout all the generations. And the Rebbe's family, generations ago even, it's been discussed how they are from the Davidic line. And some of the Rebbe's ancestors were referred to at their time as the Moshiach, the presumed Moshiach of their generations. The Maharal of Prague, for example, is one of the Rebbe's ancestors, who was also a direct descendant from the King David. And so when we go through the steps of presumed Moshiach, the Rebbe ticks those boxes. The Rebbe checks those boxes, working towards being someone who, getting back to the list that we quoted from Maimonides on page 215, be supremely pious and well-versed in the Torah, influence the Jewish nation to follow the ways of the Torah. Who did more for influencing the Jewish ways of the Torah in our generation than the Rebbe? Sending out thousands of emissaries throughout the world to cause this tremendous return to original Judaism, to true Judaism. The Pew study, if you're aware of it, recently came out. The first time they asked about Chabad, it comes out that a whopping 38% of world Jewry are affiliated with Chabad to some degree. More than any other branch of Judaism, if you will. Or at least equal or more than any other branch of Judaism. Who would ever think that a fully traditional following all the laws is something that the Rebbe accomplished that no one else has ever accomplished throughout history? And waging God's battles, at least ideologically, the Rebbe was constantly waging the ideological battles through his letters, through his meetings with the world leaders, and so on and so forth. So much so that it's not just, as we saw, that it's kind of expected that if someone's leader, someone's Rebbe fits the bill of presumed Mashiach, it's almost like an obligation, the Talmud tells us, for them to believe that their Rebbe will be the Mashiach if they fit the bill. Verified not, because that won't know once Mashiach comes. But at least to presume the potential Mashiach of that generation. So much so that it's not just the Rebbe's followers. Throughout the years, even now, there are many, many people who are not Chabad followers who say that the Rebbe is presumed Mashiach. And one that sticks out quite uniquely is, I forget his name, Rabbi, there we are. Turn my pages to go find the page. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who was the former dean of the former leader, Rosh Yeshiva, head of the Yeshiva of Yeshiva University, and which is decidedly not Chabad. And he currently heads a yeshiva in Israel, in Gush Etzion, and he was the son-in-law of Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, the great Rav, the founder of Yeshiva University. And he spoke once in 1994, and he said, it's interesting to know that no one has ever said that his father-in-law, Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, is Moshiach. No one even imagined it. Why? Because he didn't fit the bill of what Maimonides says are presumed Moshiach. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, one of the greatest leaders of Jewry of our generation, passed away in 1984. The greatest halachic decider of our generation. No one has ever said that he's the Moshiach. This is what Rabbi Lichtenstein said in his speech. He says, but for some reason, everyone felt that the Rebbe is Moshiach. Everyone feels that the Rebbe is Moshiach. Why? Because the Rebbe fits the bill. Now, is that definite? There's no way to know until Moshiach comes. And ultimately, does it really matter? No, because what matters is that Moshiach comes and ushers in the world peace. But it's almost as if it's incumbent upon us to look around and see who fits the bill and throw our weight behind that person until Moshiach comes. With that, it's important to emphasize that the redemption does not begin, and Maimonides spells that out very clearly in this chapter of Maimonides, it does not begin until it checks all the boxes. Until Moshiach, until we're certain that Moshiach is here. So until Moshiach carries out all these things of the presumed Moshiach and is successful with them, and then goes ahead and builds the temple, and then goes ahead and does the ingathering of the exiles, that's when Moshiach begins and not before them. That's when the redemption begins and not before them. And so yes, there may be some movement towards the era of Moshiach. Yes, there may be some movement towards the coming of Moshiach. But it does not begin the coming of Moshiach. The redemption has not begun. It hasn't. Just like by a wedding. There's the pictures leading up to the wedding. There's the reception. There's the cocktail reception. There's the bachelor party the night before. There's the family coming in. Those are all very important points. But has the actual marriage happened? No. The marriage happens when the bride and groom are standing under the chuppah and the groom slips the ring onto the bride's finger. That's when the marriage happens, not before. Maimonides tells us that until these boxes are all checked and Moshiach is definitely here, he builds the temple, Moshiach has not begun. The redemption hasn't actually begun. We're getting there, we're close, but it hasn't begun yet, it's not the beginning. Which leads us to an interesting historical aspect, and that is that throughout history, there have been attempts. Throughout history, there have been various Moshiachs, if you will, who came. Who were these Moshiachs? So some of the Moshiachs, and we're going to highlight two of them from throughout history, some of them were failed Moshiachs. What does failed Moshiachs mean? They were the actual presumed Moshiach of their generation. They were the potential Moshiach of their generation. But because that generation didn't carry it through, they failed. And then there were the false Moshiachs. The false Moshiachs were people who never stood a chance. They didn't fit the bill. But for whatever reason, they were charlatans. They came out, they announced that they were Moshiachs, even though they were clearly not Moshiach. And sadly, there were many throughout the ages. The first one that we have is a failed Moshiach, not a false Moshiach, but a failed Moshiach. And he's known, his name was Bar Kokhba. Who was Bar Kokhba? Bar Kokhba led a rebellion against the Roman occupiers in the 2nd century CE, of the Common Era. And he's the most famous attempt of Judaism's most famous attempt to field a Moshiach candidate. Here's a short clip that gives us a little historical background to the story of Bar Kokhba.
From its inception, the Jewish nation lived with a messianic vision Even in the worst of times, the Jews anticipated the rise of their star, a savior from the tribe of Judah who would liberate them from foreign subservience and enable religious freedom. 2,000 years ago, Rome stretched forth its mighty branches. In 6 of the Common Era, Judea, the heart of the Jewish homeland, became a Roman province. A few decades later, in the wake of the Great Jewish Revolt, the Romans destroyed the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. That marked the onset of the Jewish nation's exile and persecution. At the same time, the Jews could now anticipate their liberation through the promised Jewish Messiah. In 117 CE, Hadrian became Roman emperor. He toured the empire, erecting pagan temples and promoting Roman beliefs. When he reached ruined Jerusalem in the year 130, he ordered the city plowed over and rebuilt as a Roman city named Aelia Capitolina, with a temple to Jupiter, the chief Roman deity, erected on the site of the Holy Temple on the Temple Mount. This was more than the Jews could take, and in 132 CE, a major revolt began unlike any other. The rebels assaulted the Roman garrison stationed in Judea and succeeded in capturing and holding part of the territory. As Jews from the diaspora flocked to join the cause, Hadrian responded by sending massive reinforcements from Syria, Egypt, and Arabia, but these were similarly defeated. Rome was badly shaken. Hadrian realized the need to muster a truly enormous army in response. He summoned legions from across the globe, including his best general, Julius Severus, who was ordered to travel from Britain with 3 European legions, and units were dispatched from as far as the Danube. Nearly 1/3 of the colossal Roman army was redirected to counter the Jewish revolt. The Jewish army was led by Bar Kokhba, about whom we know precious little.
The name Bar Kokhba wasn't really the man's name. We actually know his name was Shimon Bar Kosiba, but he was called Bar Kokhba because of a biblical verse in the book of Numbers, Darach Kochav miYaakov v'kam shevet miYisrael, that a star will come forth from Jacob and a staff will arise from Israel. And this verse was understood to refer to the Messiah. As far as we know, many Jews believed that Bar Kokhba was indeed the Messiah and that they were supporting the coming of the Messiah in participating in the revolt.
Such views were reinforced by Bar Kokhba's military gains and his liberation of Jerusalem.
What's really amazing is that during the period of Bar Kokhba's rule, he put out coins. On the back side of some of these coins was actually the words Elazar Kohen, Elazar, the high priest, apparently. And this may indicate that they tried to restart sacrifices.
Despite Bar Kokhba's widespread support, the Jewish sages were sharply divided on whether Bar Kokhba was the Messiah.
There were different views among the very important rabbis that we know from the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva was convinced that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. The Jerusalem Talmud actually records him as saying, "This is the King Messiah." At the same time, others, like Yochanan ben Torta, were convinced that he couldn't possibly be the Messiah. And he told Rabbi Akiva that grass will be growing on your nose, meaning you'll be in the grave before this guy will ever be a Messiah.
Eventually, the tide turned. The legions launched a campaign of systematic annihilation that left Judea almost entirely depopulated. The Roman historian Dio Cassius writes, very few of them in fact survived. 50 of their most important outposts and 985 of their villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles, and the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and fire were past finding out. Bar Kokhba withdrew into the fortress town of Beitar. It was besieged and fell in 135 CE, ending the revolt. Its occupants were slaughtered in an enormous massacre on the 9th of Aleph, the date in the Hebrew calendar on which the first and second temple had been destroyed. Bar Kokhba died there, and Hadrian bitterly oppressed the Jews and the Jewish practice in retaliation.
Some years ago, I was at a scholarly conference about the Bar Kokhba revolt, and an Israeli archaeologist mentioned they had actually already located over 500 of these villages. I imagine that by now, he probably found a lot more. So here we see that these events really occurred, and that this war and this tragedy was as great as we find in our sources.
In the ensuing 2 millennia of Jewish exile, the Jews, unlike the Romans, survived and thrived, returned and rebuilt, and continue to eagerly await the fulfillment of God's promise of redemption.
So there we have Bar Kokhba, who was a failed Moshiach. He was assumed to be Moshiach. Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest sages, threw his weight behind him. As a matter of fact, he became his armor bearer, and he supported him entirely. But unfortunately, it didn't work out for Bar Kokhba. And as Maimonides concludes in his in the laws of Moshiach, he writes that he is like all the other worthy kings of the Davidic dynasty who died. He was from the Davidic dynasty, and he died leading the Jewish people. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't false that Rabbi Akiva supported him. He was a failed Mashiach. He was the presumed Mashiach of his generation, but for whatever reason wasn't ready, which sets him apart entirely from the false Mashiachs who came after him. Perhaps the most notable false Mashiach of all times is Shabtai Tzvi. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi was an interesting character. He was born in 1626 in the city of Izmir in Turkey. And he was handsome, he was charismatic, he was very knowledgeable, he mastered the entire Talmud and the entire Kabbalah, and he gained a following of disciples at a very, very young age. At the age of 22 in 1648, he declared himself Moshiach. And throughout the following years, he lived in Constantinople and Alexandria and Jerusalem and many cities. Primarily, he jumped around because in every city he went, the rabbinic authorities of the city denounced him. He's not Moshiach, he's a lunatic, and there's no way that he's Moshiach. Unfortunately, the news spread far and wide. It was a very tough time for the Jewish people. It was immediately following the Bolshevik pogroms of 1648 and 1649, and the Jews were grabbing at any straw they can for any hope. And so they grabbed onto Shabtai Tzvi, who was very charismatic, who traveled the world, whose stories traveled far and wide. And everything else didn't travel as fast. As it's attributed to Winston Churchill, but they say it about others. I'm not sure who actually said it, but a lie travels halfway around the world before a truth can get its pants on. And so the excitement about Shabtai Tzvi traveled very far, but the rabbis who denounced him immediately from every town, which is why in his short 20-year stint as Moshiach, he lived in so many cities, it's hard to count. And he gained a pretty large following. But one of the reasons why he was clearly not accepted, because as we saw from Maimonides, he has to be someone who's diligently involved and follows, very pious, and follows all the laws of Torah and mitzvahs. One of the first things he did was announce publicly in Turkey and cry out God's ineffable name, which is a prohibition according to Torah. Immediately, the local rabbis all denounced him that he can't be Moshiach because he doesn't add up with the laws. And so on and so forth. He started breaking laws as it went along, all in the guise that he's a prophet and he can break the laws, which is obviously not the rules of Mashiach. And it all came to a head and was proven that he was the false Mashiach when, at the age of 40, in 1666, he was captured and was told that either he'll be killed or he should convert to Islam. And guess what he did? This so-called Moshiach. He converted to Islam. And for the next 10 years, he lived as a good Muslim for 10 years. And nonetheless, unfortunately, there were still Jews who blindly followed him, even as he broke the entire Torah until he died in 1676. And so unfortunately, you can't blame the Jews at the time going through what they did following him. But nonetheless, it was very clear from all Jewish leaders of the time, once they understood of exactly who he was, that he wasn't the Moshiach. And so we see from Maimonides of exactly who Moshiach is, what he is, how we're going to know who he is. And it's those guidelines and only those guidelines that according to Jewish law we follow. But now the question is, so once Moshiach comes, and he does those 6 points that Maimonides points out. He concludes the ingathering of the exiles. He builds the temple on Temple Mount. And now the entire world is recognizing who Moshiach is and who God is through Moshiach. Do we need Moshiach? Do we need a king? Do we need someone to wage wars? There's not going to be any wars, as we'll see at length in next week's class. Everything's done. What will then be Moshiach's role? He's waged the battles. He entered us into Israel, built the temple. Now what? So following the past 3 lessons that we have, the idea that the ultimate purpose is to make a dwelling place for God in this physical world. What is the idea of Moshiach as a king? Because we explained that it has to come through our work. It can't be superimposed upon us. It has to be not superimposed, but a transformative work, which means it has to come through us, not through being forced into it. So how does Moshiach's role as a king, leading the ingathering of the exiles, fit with that? And what's going to happen once that happens? The answer is that Moshiach will then transition into, or mature, if you will, into a different role. He'll transition from being this leader of a revolution into an inspiring teacher that will sustain and bask in that revolution, in order to sustain and bask in that revolution. In traditional Jewish terminology of Jewish law, he will transition from being a melech, a king who led the revolution, to a nasi, a leader who will now lead the Jewish people as they go through enjoying this revolution, basking in the knowledge of God. And we'll conclude with text 20 on page 223. The need for Moshiach to serve as a monarch is, as defined by Maimonides, to elevate the true faith, fill the world with justice, destroy the power of the wicked, and wage the campaigns of God. Accordingly, once Moshiach has successfully influenced all humanity to serve God in unison, and the entire world will be exclusively engaged in divine pursuits, Moshiach's role as a monarch will no longer be necessary to the same degree. At that stage, his primary role will be to teach the people and direct them on the divine path, influencing them as a nasi, a leader and teacher. And so the whole idea of Moshiach as a king will relatively fade away, and now Moshiach's primary feature will be that of a leader and a teacher. We'll conclude it with the key points.
Lesson 5, Out of the Blues. 1. Isaiah describes 2 options for the redemption: in its time and hastily. If we are meritorious, the redemption will arrive earlier and in a sudden and abrupt manner. If not, the redemption will come in its default time, and it will unfold as a gradual process. 2. Malachi prophesies that Elijah the prophet will return before the arrival of the day of God, before the coming of Mashiach. Chief among his duties will be to announce the imminence of Mashiach's arrival. 3. Mashiach will be a mortal who will possess incredible qualities and will achieve tremendous spiritual heights. On top of that, he will be exceedingly humble. The Kabbalists reveal that Mashiach's soul will embody the essence of the collective soul, the Yechidah, of all of creation. 4. Maimonides outlines 2 stages in identifying Mashiach: A. Presumed Mashiach, and B. Confirmed Mashiach. A descendant of King David who is pious and versed in Torah influences the Jewish nation to follow the Torah's ways and wages God's battles is presumed to be Mashiach. If he gathers the Jews to the land of Israel and builds the 3rd holy temple, he is the confirmed Mashiach. 5. Each generation has a potential Mashiach. Throughout history, students of various influential Jewish spiritual leaders have pointed to their leader as the potential Mashiach. However, the redemption has not begun until Mashiach successfully completes the tasks of the confirmed Mashiach. 6. There have been various historical attempts at actual messianic campaigns. Two particularly famous attempts are Bar Kokhba and Shabbatai Tzvi, with the distinction that Bar Kokhba was a failed potential Mashiach, whereas Shabbatai Tzvi was a false Mashiach. 7. At a certain point, Mashiach's role will transition or mature from king to primarily that of an inspiring teacher and religious mentor.